much. But thank you all for being here with us. If you haven't attended anything yet today, my name is Matt Gayer. I'm the Executive Director at Spur Local. And excited to talk to you today about the results of our Executive Director and Staff Burnout Survey. I'll talk a little context about the survey here in a second, and dive into what we're seeing data-wise and also what some of the action steps are from it. We're going to get to the actual survey and local data results here in just a second. Just wanted to give a little context, right, for where these results kind of fit into some of the broader sector trends we're seeing. So we'll cover those quickly and then spend the majority of our time talking about the data itself and some of the things we might want to do coming out of that data. All right, so the first trend, and you'll see this, I think, show up in some of the answers around some of the stress that nonprofit leaders are feeling right now, is around the funding, right? So we know that fundraising is largely flat right now. Grassroots donors have continued to decline. It's a decline that likely continued in 2023. We don't have final numbers yet from last year, but as I was saying at the opening today, 2022 rate saw a 22% decline in grassroots donors year over year. 2023 probably saw less of a decline, but still a decline there. So we still have less people giving. We're more reliant on major donors than we have been before, and major donor giving isn't increasing. It's kind of stagnant or slightly decreasing. So all those things add up to there's a good chance that 2023's total giving will be a little bit lower than 2022, which already was the first decline in individual giving that happened since 2008, 2010. So when we look at that, the natural question we often get is why, and also what can we do about it. The why is a variety of factors, right? There's no kind of one individual reason. Some of it is economic uncertainty, right? Some of it is actual kind of inflation rate and cost, and folks needing to cut back on giving and other expenses. And a lot of it, though, is also just the mood in the room. What we're hearing from donors, what we're seeing in studies like independent sector study on trust last year, is that folks' pessimism around the political sphere is bleeding over into their feelings around the nonprofit sector. And we're seeing that kind of show up in lower levels of trust. We're seeing that show up in lower levels of kind of self-efficacy and thinking that their donations, their volunteering, et cetera, can make change. All that to say, on the fundraising kind of front, it's a mixed bag at best, possibly a difficult outlook for the next kind of 6 or 12 months. And we're seeing this show up, and we'll talk about this in the survey results, as stress for executive directors and development folks. Secondly, we're seeing, though, at the same time that's true, the community wants to know what we're doing. There's a lot of interest, right, in realistic stories from the community. So how we're sharing those authentically, really important. So thinking about our communications, thinking about our program evaluation. We were talking earlier in one of the staff sessions about collaboration between teams and organizations. This is a great example of the need for that, right? The need to kind of have communications and development and programming all talking to each other to make sure we're getting the right stories out there to engage our audiences. And then finally, and this is something that will show up directly in the survey data we're about to share, is that more and more nonprofits are thinking about these kind of alternative staff benefits, right? So meaning going beyond the health insurance, right? So how are organizations kind of prioritizing rest for staff? How are organizations prioritizing professional development? How are organizations prioritizing wellness? We see this showing up in a variety of ways, even organizations with really small budgets, finding really creative and kind of unique ways to invest in these things. That these making a real difference for kind of staff and staff engagement there. And then finally, I won't spend long here, but just again, a good example of why we're hearing, why you'll see in the data, executive directors, other senior leaders feeling like so much is on their plate, is that the communication that they're having to do even is much more nuanced than it used to be, right? Like, so it needs to be authentic. We see audiences responding really well to authentic, strong stories, but as any of us know, those authentic, strong stories take a lot of time, right? And take a lot of focus and intentionality. And staff are kind of seeing that, seeing that as kind of a pull on their time. So as promised, we'll spend most of our next kind of 50 minutes together talking about the results of this year's survey, the context for that survey, and then also some of the things we can do as a result of it. So a little context, the executive director and staff burnout survey. This is a survey we've been running for 3 years now, and run every year in kind of late winter, early spring. And the core questions have remained consistent across the kind of years that we've been doing this, adding questions on both this year, specifically on what leaders are doing around staff benefits, and also proactively looking at how they feel about the work and rest to come. So looking at a little more outlook in addition to kind of what's currently happening. We were really grateful this year that our partners actively participated. So we had over 170 nonprofit leaders represented in the survey results you're about to see, over 160 organizations, and a relatively representative sample. So for instance, 72% of our organizations are led by a woman, 79% of responses were from women-identified folks, and similarly, 40% of the network has BIPOC leadership, and 35% of survey respondents identified as a person of color. So pretty close to, kind of exactly representative, very close to representative of our overall kind of nonprofit network. And all of these were local. So all these organizations that responded were in the Spur Local Network, are local to the region. So if you are kind of joining from outside the DMV today, we still think that all this is relevant. I think this is true for kind of small nonprofits, probably pretty much anywhere, especially anywhere that's near kind of a major city. But for those of you that are in the DC region, these are all organizations that are down the street from you, might include you. It should be pretty relevant to your daily experience. So what do those 170 leaders tell us? So the first question, the first thing we always look at is this question of executive director burnout, right? So when we look about the co-executive director or executive director of the organization, how are they doing in terms of their wellness and their engagement at work? The first year we did this, over 70% of local executive directors said they were either burnt out, about to be burnt out, or have been recently burnt out, right? So almost 3/4 of folks that filled out the survey the first year felt like they were kind of in that burnout realm. Last year that improved slightly to about 65%, and this year again improved again to 56%. So it's one of those moments, right, where we see that and we're really excited to see that number continue to go down, but also a sobering moment when you pause and realize that means 1 out of 2, right? So if virtually you could look at the ED to your left and right, one of those folks statistically is probably near or currently experiencing a level of kind of burnout and disengagement with the work. So a lot more work to do here. We're very happy to see this number going in the right direction, but it's going to take some real kind of focused systemic support from philanthropy, from foundations to continue this trend. Because anecdotally, from talking to some people about this, some of this feels like leaders better prioritizing it themselves. Some of this feels like the situation's better on the ground than it was a couple of years ago. But more meaningful and deeper change is going to require funding and going to require support that may not be there right now. Across our data, there weren't a lot of kind of variations in terms of kind of identity responses, other than female identified executive directors or co-executive directors were more likely at about 58% to have a sense of burnout or kind of disengagement with the work currently than male counterparts, right? As we said, this was a relatively representative sample. And when we talk about burnout, someone had asked this in the chat already. We asked about if you are within kind of 1 or 2 months of having been burnt out, if you're currently burnt out, or you feel like you're about to be in that kind of burnout realm. Something that was really interesting that we saw that we hadn't asked before, but we asked this year, was around executive directors being able to fully prioritize their own well-being, right? About 14% of executive directors said that's currently the case. But what was interesting to see is like there's a real level of optimism amongst executive directors that we surveyed that of those who don't fall in that 14% currently, 82% think they'll be able to in the relatively near future. So either things are getting a lot better, or there's maybe a little over optimism, right, around kind of things getting better. There, one ED talking about, this has happened before. They feel like they're going to be able to prioritize their well-being, but something unexpected often occurs, right, that keeps them from doing so. So while we appreciate the fact that it looks like a lot of people are thinking about their wellness moving forward, time will tell, right? And the survey next year will be really interesting to see, did that actually translate to more executive director kind of nonprofit leader wellness? Hopefully, but time will tell there. A couple quotes we just wanted to share anecdotally from some of these questions right around burnout and kind of wellness, kind of just remind folks that behind these numbers are the people in this meeting, right? Are the people doing the work in the community, or the people across our network. One being something we've heard from a lot of folks that I think sums it up a little bit, which is around kind of choosing to prioritize their staff well-being over their own. It shouldn't be a choice. But I have to do this both because it's the right thing to do, and it's the only way I'm going to retain those staff. And if I lost those staff, my job would be worse anyway. This is something we'll see when we look at the team data here in just a second. But we've seen the team staff engagement and the team burnout rates go in a positive direction a lot faster than the executive director rates. One reason for that being, anecdotally, we hear executive directors realized a couple of years ago how important that team engagement piece was and have invested in it as a result, meaning that they've delayed investment in their own wellness, but it's led to greater engagement and wellness for their staff. The other thing we wanted to highlight, because we think that this is a really good example, right, of how the current expectations around workflow are unsustainable, often for executive directors and for other leaders at the organizations that we work with. I'm able to prioritize my well-being about 2 to 3 weeks a month. Often unexpected issues arise, particularly challenging as they upend my self-care plans, such as exercise and rest. I find it challenging to fit in things like doctor's appointments around my work schedule without needing to work on the weekend or evenings, right? Again, something that I think probably a lot of folks resonate with, understand that sentiment. Something we heard from our keynote speaker this morning already. But about the kind of physical and mental wellness taking a backseat for nonprofit leaders, given the kind of the current demands kind of relation to the work and rest. So something we definitely will talk about some of the tips for here in just a minute. So looking at the second data point, the second kind of set of questions in the survey deals more with our teams, right? So how do nonprofit leaders feel like their staff are doing? What are staff reporting to them? The majority of teams were burnt out when we first started conducting the survey, or the majority of organizations felt like their teams were burnt out. It's gone lower every year since. Now the majority of teams do not seem burnt out to the nonprofit leaders at their organization, but still an opportunity to go lower there, much like with the ED data as well. Why this is important, we'll talk about how local nonprofit leaders feel their team is doing here in just a second. But why this matters so much is that the voluntary turnover rate in nonprofits, which is, people leaving because they choose to from their current employer, is about 19%, and that's higher than the all industry average of 12%, and statistically significantly higher. So nonprofits do still have a turnover problem. Data is increasingly showing that it's not just due to salary. So a lot of times folks thought for a long time that turnover rate was because folks were leaving to get more money in the for-profit sector. That's still somewhat the case, right? And maybe a contributing factor. But we're hearing more and more it's about the workflow, about the culture, about the flexibility, about the advancement opportunities, the ownership, those other elements that we actually can control a bit more which is what's really leading to the kind of turnover volume that we're seeing. This gap is larger in the past, larger than in the past. So nonprofits have always had kind of a higher turnover rate than kind of the all industry average. The 7% gap is bigger than it has been. So finally, how are our nonprofit leaders feeling about this? Well, about half of nonprofits surveyed said that their team burnout, their team stress, disengagement has kind of leveled off. So when they're thinking about the most recent year in 2023, they feel like that team engagement, burnout, etc., is roughly the same as it was in 2022. That may sound like a bad thing, right? We want that to get better. That's actually great that we're seeing that stabilize. We'd love to see it stabilize at an even lower level, but the fact that it's not continuing to go up, and the fact that it's still continuing to kind of come down or kind of stay steady, is really great to see there. Of the remaining kind of 50%, about 20% thought the burnout and stress of their organization got worse, and about a third thought it got better. Right. So overall, more people than not thought things were getting better, with the other half of people thinking things are about the same. While we always want to see these numbers continue to improve, that's a pretty positive story we're telling. Overall, about 80% of organizations felt like their burnout and disengagement on their staff did not get worse. And that's a really, again, a much higher number than we've had in years past, and something that we're excited to see what that means for organizations and their staff. I will say, I just want to pause there and say that as we're going through this, if you're seeing this and you feel like you're in that 20% right, or at any of these times you feel like you're in the other percent that we're not talking about there, that's what some of the tips are that we'll talk about here after the data. So after we get done looking through the data, we'll talk about some of the best practices we can do to kind of respond to some of these trends. We'll also cover this in other sessions across the next 2 days as well. Our third kind of set, our next 2 sets of data, I should say, really started asking the questions like, okay, burnout is real for executive directors, is real for senior leaders at nonprofits. What do we need to do about it? And more importantly, what do those leaders feel like they need about it, right? What would actually be helpful to them in their opinion? The 3 buckets of kind of supports implementations they were able to choose from were things around trust, things around investment, and things around support. So for trust, the 2 things that were on there were trust-based philanthropy. So we defined that a little bit for them, but basically institutional funders trusting the nonprofits that they fund, meaning that the applications are a little less onerous, the reports are a little less onerous, the gifts have less strings attached to them, right? Because we're trusting the organizations that we're granting to. The other trust-based activity being a sabbatical, right? So kind of trusting that leader to take the rest they need to come back with the organization forward. The 2 most common answers here when asked what leaders need was a need for trust-based philanthropy, so more institutional givers using trust-based practices, and the need for more board support. So boards, foundations, corporations, those are kind of the 3 big funding sources that leaders said would really help them feel more at rest and more at ease in their role. So there's more trust-based philanthropy and more support from the board. Now, that did not just include financial support from the board, but that means partnership, asking the right questions, stepping up to do tasks that you commit to, right? And spending the time, I mean, to be kind of an engaged board member. In addition to those top 2, the next kind of layer came out 38% saying a sabbatical would be helpful for their engagement. So a strong showing by that, because we know a lot of folks haven't considered that before, or if they have, don't feel like it's realistic. We saw a lot of organizations that may not be in a place to offer one right now want to begin to think about it, to think about how they might be able to do in the future. The other option kind of came in of that similar kind of mid-30s part is around wanting professional development and coaching, right? With a little over 1/3 of participants prioritizing professional development and coaching is what they need to feel more invested there. About a quarter of leaders wish there was easier or more affordable access to mental and physical health programs, and a little less than 1/5, our smallest response here, I believe that their staff should be supporting them more instead of some of these other groups. So when we look at this, our big takeaway here is that there are some clear marching orders for boards. There's some clear marching orders for trust-based philanthropy at institutions, specifically foundations and corporations, and continuing to look at things we can offer leaders in terms of uh, proactive rest in the form of sabbatical, proactive development in the form of kind of professional development, capacity building, coaching. Going to be really important to keep these leaders engaged moving forward. All right. So if we know leaders are feeling burnt out, and we now know what leaders want to deal with that burnout, the question naturally becomes, why aren't leaders doing it? Right? Why are leaders not taking advantage of these things that they know exist out there to try to get help with the different challenges that they're facing? So not surprising, the main one was time. Right? Probably could have guessed this before we showed the slide. You probably could have guessed this before we did the survey. But 64% of leaders responded that time was the biggest barrier to finding the supports they need. They knew what they needed. They knew, in some cases, even where to get that support, but just the thought of actually going through the time to do it was overwhelming and, and a barrier for them. The other main barrier we saw here was money. A lot of the things we talked about as supports for those executive directors that might be helpful don't necessarily have a cost tied to it, but some of it does, right? Some of those added benefits, if we're putting them out on a sabbatical and bringing in someone to work part time where they're gone, that has a cost. So there is a cost to a lot of that work, not all of it, but a lot. Something to think about. The other time component that we saw equally, if not more so, mentioned was 70% of leaders responded that staff capacity, particularly, was the challenge, right? We can't do X, Y, or Z because we don't have the staff to get it done. That ultimately boils down to we don't have the time to get it done, right? So we put those kind of lumped together, but an interesting kind of finding there. And then finally, it does like buy-in is the main answer. A few years back, if you'd asked this question, feel pretty confident from the anecdotal stories we used to get told that buy-in piece around the board supporting a sabbatical or our donors understanding why I'm taking one would have been a top answer. These days, as folks have become more aware of the work of systems, of power, of equity, that buy-in piece is a little less prevalent. And we see in general, definitely not a hard and fast rule, but in general, individual donors be a little more progressive than some of the institutional funders that might be working. And then finally, we wanted to dive in a little deeper here still to that trust-based support part, right? So you had half of EDs feeling a sense of burnout. Of those, that we surveyed, half of them said like more trust-based philanthropy at institutions, specifically foundations and corporations, would make me less stressed and make me more engaged. So now, what does that actually mean, right? And like, let's dive deeper into that trust-based philanthropy space. Uh, 95% of the nonprofit leaders, so basically universal of the nonprofit leaders surveyed, ranked multi-year funding and general operating funding as the two most important trust-based pieces a foundation can do. Again, for any of my nonprofits on the call, there's going to be some head nods, but probably not any surprise and a lot of agreements, right? When we think about that multi-year funding and the general operating funding. Now, while this is a clear-cut priority for nonprofits, I will say we've also done a couple different cohorts where during the last session, we're talking about things we should be advocating for them. And this is specifically something that's come up multiple times. That folks really need that kind of, even just 2-year funding. It doesn't have to be 5 or 6 years, but 2 years to understand where their money is going to be coming from, not just this year, but the year ahead. The news on that front, though, because we wanted to share some trends we see on each of these with the actual kind of foundation corporate sector and what they're giving, is that while applications are getting shortened, reports are being less onerous than they used to be, and a lot of organizations, not all, but a lot, The funding part of this, the multi-year funding, the general operating funds, the actual kind of structure of the money that they're giving you has generally not changed. If it has, we'll have some time for questions later, and I'd love to hear kind of where you're getting a lot of unrestricted funding from. But in general, we see that as not really shifting as much as we would hope, given the level of conversation with philanthropic institutions and trust-based philanthropy. When it comes to the process for applying for grants, about 3/4 of nonprofits would like a simpler application and reporting. I will say the caveat with that is that folks always want a simpler application and reporting. So it doesn't necessarily mean your application and reporting is too long or too complicated, but it does mean that you just want to be kind of aware of that process, right? And what people are putting into it. We're hoping that foundations kind of continue on the trend that we've already seen, that they get better and better at making that process simpler. We have seen some wins on that. And then finally, looking at the relationship itself with the institutional funder, 40% of organizations, so a pretty significant percentage, would like support that goes beyond just the grant or money. So this could be capacity building support, this could be access to a mentor, this could be access to coaching or some type of consulting, collaborative, etc. That doesn't exist yet, but that they would be excited to build. And then 20%, 26% want more transparent communication. So they want to feel like they know what's happening. These people are probably good folks to engage with foundations more. Foundations here have improved a lot of their language, but again, the language is improving, but the structural funding is not. And that's where we see the biggest takeaway from this slide, if you have one, is that nonprofit leaders universally need and want the multi-year funding and gen ops support. And that's the area that has seen the least amount of shifting from institutional donors so far. And our final kind of data bucket that we wanted to share out, which is around the team investment piece. So this is a new area we added this year, so we'll have more kind of comparative data on this next year when we bring this back to y'all. But it was really looking at how are nonprofits investing in their own staff right now? Because as we're telling the story, that foundations and other institutional funders may not be investing in the way that we hope and the way that nonprofit leaders are asking for. We also want to see how are nonprofit leaders investing in their own teams and in themselves. And the answer is not surprisingly strongly and in a really values aligned way. So 87% of those 160 plus nonprofits we surveyed offer health insurance benefits, 3/4 offer retirement and professional development, about the same offer dental and vision, 1/4 of them offer transportation, and 16% of those surveyed offered all of those and more, right? So when we're looking at this, especially as we compare it, you'll see this on the far right column here, as we compare this to small businesses in the space, we actually are investing more in a lot of these benefits, right? Small nonprofits are more likely than small businesses to offer health insurance to their staff. We're making kind of values aligned investments in the team, both to kind of retain them, but also because it's the right thing to do. And our organizations are investing in that as they're financially able to, right? There's only so much they can do, but so far have really made some great early investments in that. When we look outside of just benefits, but also kind of time and space, we see about 3/4 of organizations are offering more than 2 weeks of vacation. Why we drew the line there is because the national average of vacation offered is 10 days or less. So that means 3/4 of our partners are offering more than the national average of vacation time that's given to employees. Always room to grow there, always room to grow on all this, but organizations do seem to be kind of making investments beyond what would be expected given their budget size to help staff kind of have access to some of these benefits and access to some rest and restorative spaces. The most common level of vacation was somewhere between kind of 11 and 15 days, 3 weeks of vacation, basically. That was about 1/3 of organizations. So you had some organizations that are above that, some below it, but the majority were in that kind of 2 to 3 week, 2 to 4 week grouping. And about 10%, we're looking at emerging trends. We did not this year, but next year we'll definitely ask about the 4-day work week. About 10% of organizations have unlimited PTO now. for their staff as well. The really kind of incredible thing about these numbers that are already pretty strong here in terms of how nonprofit leaders are investing in their staff is that these numbers probably are getting stronger. 54% of nonprofits surveyed increased their benefits for staff in the past year. So these benefits you're seeing here for over half of organizations surveyed have already gotten better than they were a year before. And we expect that to continue. So nonprofits continue to invest in their staff in really kind of tangible, practical ways here. And this is keeping pace with other sectors. Again, in some cases, like with small businesses, outpacing other sectors. So with all this information, right, half of EDs are feeling some sense of burnout. There's optimism it's going to get better, but we don't know yet. Teams are doing better, but there's still some level of burnout that's kind of prevalent. And nonprofit leaders really want more support from boards and foundations and may not be getting it in the way they want to. And teams are investing in themselves. What are some tips, actions? What are some kind of next steps we can take coming out of this? So the first tip, and this would be something good to share with your board members as well here, but is making sure you're talking to and checking in with your nonprofit staff leaders. So this would be senior leaders of the organization as well as the executive director. We just know from the data that if you talk to a handful of them, you're probably talking to at least one or two people who are experiencing some level of burnout or have recently experienced some level of burnout, right? So there's a need to re-engage our leadership and to make sure that they're feeling kind of supported there, as there is with all of our staff. But with leadership specifically, we see those numbers be the highest levels of kind of burnout there. So one good example of this, a board member, asked kind of what are some ways they can do this. Simply asking sounds, minor, but simply asking our executive directors or senior staff how they are, right, and how they're doing. We did a poll of executive directors of one of our cohorts, about 20 people, asking how many of their boards in the last 3 to 6 months had asked them how they were doing, not how the organization was doing, but how they as an individual were doing. And only one person raised their hand, right? And anecdotally, we now hear it's getting a little better, maybe to like 10 to 20%, but the majority of boards are not asking that very simple question about just how are you as a leader. Hopefully modeling that so the ED is asking their senior staff as well. So really important, as we talked about in the keynote, that folks are thinking about the organization from an individual and collective perspective, right? We need to be building capacity of the organization. We need to think about organizational wellness. We can't do that without thinking about individual wellness and individual capacity as well. Secondly, we're thinking about kind of just checking in, right? So putting in more regular check-ins with either senior staff or with the board and executive director, because we see even just knowing a check-in is going to happen actually makes someone less stressed, right? It makes them feel less alone. So knowing that board chair is going to ask me in 2 weeks about how I'm doing lets me know that someone's going to ask me the next 2 weeks, right, how I'm doing. So it's going to make it more likely you feel, again, kind of safe and engaged in the space. It's going to help with those feelings of kind of isolation. It gives leaders kind of a conversation to look forward to, and also a reason to kind of take notes, right? A lot of times you get to those conversations, someone asks how you're doing, and you don't have an adequate answer, right? You don't really know what to say, even though there are things you want to say. Knowing when those conversations are going to happen, not having them all just be ad hoc, is going to allow people to kind of come in and be prepared for that. And then finally, as possible, we just really are encouraging, and we hear this time and time again from our nonprofit EDs, that leaders talking to other leaders is incredibly helpful, right? So like we did with the peer-to-peer sessions today, folks getting a chance to actually connect with each other, converse, talk through a topic, brainstorm, agree, disagree, etc. Really, really helpful for their engagement, really helpful for their understanding of their role, their job, expectations. So something we really encourage people to consider. The second kind of tip or takeaway from the data we shared today is around this idea, especially on that last slide about benefits, about rest, about some of the ways we're investing in our staff. We have made some great progress, right? And again, 54% of organizations have invested more in their teams than they were a year ago. That is great to see. It doesn't end there, right? That team investment, the benefit investment, is a never ending, right? Kind of effort. The same as when we're thinking about how our organization aligns with kind of equity, justice, other values we're prioritizing. This investment in our team, our staff is going to be ongoing as well. New opportunities are going to come up on a regular basis. So, what are a couple of things we want to think about trying to continue to innovate on in this kind of area? The first is thinking about new benefits we can offer, right? So affordable options to offer something new or to remove a pain point, right? So is there something small we can do? We know we have a team that's really active. They all have, gym memberships, and we're going to offer a very small like fitness stipend, right? $50 a person or something. It may not cover a lot, but equally important to the financial benefit of that in many cases for these alternative benefits is the signal value we're providing to staff that we see you and we care about this thing you care about, right? We care about this thing that staff care about that allows them to bring their whole self to work. So thinking about what are some of those new benefits we could offer that may not have a huge cost because we may not have a huge budget to be able to throw at it, but might make folks more engaged. Secondly, increasing salary transparency. So we've seen a lot of organizations do this really well this year, that they worked with outside consultants or did their own research to create pay scales and pay bands for the different roles of the organization. So directors make between this and this, right? Managers make between this and this. That level kind of scaling, kind of pay band for the staff. And we see that doing this and letting staff know what those pay bands are is really important, right? It helps them understand kind of what negotiation might be possible, especially around kind of performance review or kind of salary increase time. Also lets them know what's going to be a non-starter and gives people context, right? So again, this is an equity issue, but also we see an engagement issue for staff, knowing that their salary is kind of within line of the pay bands that we have. Third, we're seeing staff still really prioritize this need for flexibility. So hybrid work, right? Rest, more vacation. All this really adds up to flexibility and ownership. More and more folks don't want to be that kind of 9 to 5 in the office. So how are we supporting that while still getting things done at the organization? That's the real key there. There's still that accountability piece. But a lot of organizations are not just getting better at this, but planning to do this for the long term. Someone had asked in an earlier session about how many of our organizations, the majority of their staff are back in person to the office. I would say the majority of the organizations we work with, the majority of their staff are in the office at some point each week. For none of our staff that we talk to, other than kind of frontline program staff and some of our partners, are people back 5 days a week. So the answer is hybrid, right? The majority of organizations are back kind of 2 or 3 days a week, working remotely 2 or 3 days a week, and that probably will stay true for the foreseeable future. The other two things we see that really motivate staff to kind of stay and to kind of fully engage that comes out of the data we were sharing. One of those is the culture, right? Staff stay at places that they like to be. Not surprisingly, if between the manager and the culture, if staff aren't having a good time or enjoying the work, they're probably not going to keep doing the work, right? So it's really important we're thinking about that culture piece as well. And then finally, giving staff some development opportunities, right? So as we saw there, 75% of organizations are funding professional development to some level. The vast majority are not funding it in a actual kind of dollar value high way, maybe a percentage of their budget way, but dollar value high way. So we need to do some research there to help staff find affordable professional development options. We're always happy to recommend some, so if you reach out to us, we're always happy to point you in the right direction. But also that's a great thing to talk to your executive director about and see if their network has any good development opportunities. And then finally, where do we have an opportunity to do some advocacy here? right? So when we specifically think about advocacy, not with government, but with institutional funders, right? So when thinking about specifically foundations, corporations, et cetera, what is some of the advocacy we can be doing? One of it is always around. It feels like changing that overhead myth, right? That we all know about. The nonprofits shouldn't have overhead. We shouldn't be spending money to kind of make money. We shouldn't have business operations somehow, and programming just magically happens, right? We know that is not true, but it's really important we continue to fight that fight and talk about the need for government contracts and foundations to fund overhead and make sure that organizations are covered as a result. The biggest prize, right? The biggest thing we're getting asked for, the biggest thing our partners want is that multi-year funding. And again, while it'd be great to get that 3 to 5 year, 3+ year kind of funding model out there, what most organizations are asking for as a starting place is just 2 years of funding. 2 years, if in the middle you want to do a report, that's fine, is what we hear a lot of times. People are willing to do that, they're fine doing that. They just want to make sure that they know the money's going to be there year over year, because it makes budgeting so much easier when that's true. So that still has been a slow one to move, at least in the DC region. But we're hoping as more places like Washington State make those investments, we'll see more funders in our area also follow suit. Related to that, and this is an area where more movement has happened, is general operating funds, right? So gen ops funding. We have seen the majority of organizations, not all by any means, but the majority of funders in the DC region move towards kind of gen ops funding, right? So kind of generally speaking, kind of funding. And, these are kind of bigger family foundations, funding the work you do at a broad level. There's plenty of project-based support out there. We are seeing a move towards a pretty strong move towards gen ops. What we're not necessarily seeing yet, but we want to advocate for more of is capacity building funding, right? So funding dedicated to professional development, dedicated to hiring a coach for a leader, right? Dedicated to bringing in folks that can add capacity to the individuals and the organization in which they're at. So trying to kind of see if there can be more funding for that locally. Thinking about the narrative, right? So thinking about how we shift the narrative in the nonprofit sector that it's okay for leaders and staff to not be okay, right? And that leaders and staff can be tired, can have kind of moments that they're burnt out. They can still care about the mission, and then they can come back and do that great work when they get the rest and kind of wellness that they need. I'll say anecdotally with this one, we were sharing the ED burnout survey results last year with a foundation, and they were very surprised when they saw that 64%, I think, last year of executive directors were experiencing burnout. They said, well, none of our grantees are. Everyone we talked to is doing just fine. And we were quick to tell them everyone you talk to is telling you they're doing just fine, right? Because that power dynamic currently between funders and nonprofits, we know, is that nonprofits always have to be doing okay and always somehow doing more, right? And that's what funders are looking for. So continuing to help navigate and shift as we're able to. We don't always have the power in those conversations, but as nonprofit leaders are able to have more authentic conversations about wellness, engagement, et cetera, workflow, sustainability, the better and stronger the sector is going to be. And then finally, related to that directly is that power piece. Working to better normalize that funder nonprofit communication, that funder nonprofit power. Always will be a little imbalanced by the very nature of kind of the sector and what we're asking for, but trying to balance that more than it has been in the past. So we'll have a couple other sessions, including the first session tomorrow morning, diving deeper into this data and directly what you as a manager, you as a leader can do with this and in response to it. But I want to pause there and open it up for any questions that folks have, either about the data, other things that you would like us to ask about in the future, or wondering if we asked about other kind of reactions to it. Someone asked a good question about do we see burnout rates differ by social issue focus? That is not something that we kind of cross-analyzed when we were looking at the kind of leader responses there. Not every issue had enough of a response rate, even with 160 organizations represented, to break it down there. But we'll see, and can definitely go back. Our team can look at if there's any buckets of kind of, for instance, like direct service versus indirect service, and if there's any kind of corollaries with burnout data there. Thank you for that. Other questions folks have, or other just reactions to some of this information? So one other question here in the chat: are there going to be any sessions talking about if our team already feels like there's some burnout from leaders about what to do? Yes. So tomorrow morning's session, the first one we'll do, we'll revisit this data very briefly, but then spend the vast majority of time talking about that response piece and what we do if we do feel like we fall in that 56% ourselves as executive directors, or if we're part of that group that feels like we have some burnout disengagement on our team. That'll be the first thing we talk about tomorrow morning. Someone else asked about compensation data within the network, specifically around kind of pay bands that are related to that work. Yes, so we actually do track compensation data specifically for executive directors and development directors, or where we have the best data on that, and we're always happy to share that with y'all. So if you ever have any questions about kind of ED or development staff compensation, feel free to reach out to us. For program staff, because different program issues, the staff, may have different educational requirements, licensing requirements, et cetera. We don't have great pay bands set up for that because the diversity of that is pretty far. But we do hope to add operations staff as a third bucket of pay bands this year in some of the data we're collecting. But again, ED or development data, happy to share anytime you all have questions about that. Someone's asking about any recommendations on retirement plans. So we don't have time to, that could be a whole webinar and presentation itself. We don't have time to kind of get into specifics there, other than the fact that, again, 3/4 of our organizations are doing something with retirement. That usually means they're offering some type of account, whether that's 401k, Roth 401k, 403b, et cetera, and doing some type of employer contribution to it. That could be as small as 1%. We have a lot of partners that start there. Industry average, 3%. And we didn't see any organizations doing above 3% in terms of a match. Someone was mentioning a question around the team feeling burnt out, but senior leadership maybe being unaware, right? Is there any kind of advice on approaching these topics? So that's a great question on either side of it. We also see sometimes the team is doing well, but the leader is really burnt out, and the leader may not realize their own burnout. But either way, there, whether the team's burnout, ED is not noticing, or ED is burnout and not noticing the team is. I think the big thing, we see that's helpful if you are a staff person who's not that kind of senior leader, is bringing that up at usually one-on-one initially, but then also trying to find kind of a group time to talk about that, and also kind of finding out from peers if that's a common thing the team is feeling, right? A lot of times, especially, this is one kind of specific example, but an organization with a lot of direct service staff, their executive director, right, their senior leadership may be having very different work experiences, right? They may not even be in the same physical space anymore with how hybrid work works. So it's really important that if you're seeing stuff in your pocket of work or your kind of level of the organization, you're surfacing that for senior leaders, all brought about and kind of focused on, much as the same as our keynote was talking about sabbaticals today. This is about the organization will get a real benefit from knowing that people are burnt out and from knowing that we need to do something about it, right? So I think positing it in that kind of organizational benefit language, probably going to be a receptive audience from senior leadership, I would say, in most cases, because they want to address that before it gets worse. Great. And yeah, if there's other kind of benefits y'all are offering you want to highlight, feel free to put that in the chat. Love kind of that brainstorming. This is also something for any of y'all that are partners with Spur Local Right. You have access to nonprofit Slack. I know a couple months back, folks are kind of in there, kind of brainstorming different benefits they were doing, specifically around some of their retirement accounts. So that's another option too outside the summit as well. Other questions folks have? We just have a couple minutes left, and we're going to take a few minute break as people head to their breakout sessions. Any other questions folks have? Else what that average vacation data was. So the average from our network was 3 weeks. The 11 to 15 days was the most common option. Most organizations also then had the longer you stay there, right, the more vacation you get. But the most common kind of base amount was 11 to 15, with the majority of organizations kind of being over that 2 week mark, which is the national average. But we'll also share out all the slides and reporting afterwards. So any of those specific data points you might have missed that you're excited to dive back into, you all will have access to afterwards. Great. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pause there, give folks a couple minutes. We'll put up kind of a title slide just to rest here. If you're sticking here for the next breakout session, we'll get started right at the top of the hour. Otherwise, you can use the workbook. That'll have links to the other breakout sessions that we're offering. And then we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock for our panel. We'll have some great local nonprofit leaders talking very practically about what they're doing to manage and engage their staff right now. So thank you all, and we'll see you all in a couple minutes.